Welcome to Gordon, Dark Tales. Tonight, we take you to the heart of an isolated Cuban coast, where shadows dance among the waves and whispers echo from an abandoned lighthouse. Imagine this: a young American photographer, Claire Mitchell, ventures into the eerie unknown, searching for the perfect shot. But what she finds is far from picturesque. A storm traps her, and she discovers a chilling diary, unlocking secrets of a long-forgotten tragedy. As the winds howl and the tide rises, the boundary between the living and the dead dissolves. Each word, each echo, pulls her deeper into a mystery she may never escape. Who was the lighthouse keeper, and what price did he pay for his obsession? Prepare yourself for a suspenseful journey that will have you questioning every creak, every whisper in the dark. This is not just a story, it's an experience. So put on your headphones, close your eyes, and let yourself drift into the chilling depths of the forgotten lighthouse. Stay with us until the end, if you dare. For beyond the waves lies a secret waiting to be uncovered and feared.
Hi, my name is Claire Mitchell. I'm a 29-year-old photographer from the United States. My passion, capturing stories frozen in time, especially those hidden in the crevices of history. This is how I ended up on the sun-drenched shores of Havana, Cuba, a place I thought I'd only read about in travel books. When I first arrived, the city took my breath away. The pastel-colored colonial buildings lined the cobblestone streets like an artist's palette. And the faint aroma of sea breeze mixed with the distant rhythm of salsa music filled the air. But it wasn't just the beauty of Havana that struck me. It was the stories whispered in its cracks, in the peeling paint of its walls, and the worn steps of its plazas, stories I was determined to uncover. I had come here with a clear purpose: to capture photographs that would speak louder than words for a personal project I had been dreaming of. Havana seemed like the perfect backdrop, a mix of life, color, and history. Little did I know, history here wasn't just about the past. It lingered, breathed, and sometimes reached out when you least expected. It started with a casual conversation at a small cafe near Plaza Vieja. A group of locals noticed my camera and my not-so-great attempts at speaking Spanish. They shared tales of their city, stories of resilience, culture, and traditions. But it was one particular tale that caught my attention. El perro del olvido, one of them said, lowering his voice as if the mere mention of the name demanded reverence. The lighthouse of the forgotten. I leaned in, intrigued. What's so special about it? I asked, eager to learn more. It's not special, he replied, his voice tinged with unease. It's cursed. People who go there don't come back the same. The girl stared at him as if surprised by this statement. As the story unfolded like an old fable, the lighthouse stood on a remote island off the Cuban coast, abandoned for decades, its light extinguished by time. Locals claimed it was haunted, a place where the lost and the restless lingered. I dismissed it as folklore at first. After all, every place has its myths. But as the days passed, the lighthouse gnawed at my curiosity. Its isolation, its ominous nickname, something about it felt different, compelling. When I asked others about it, I was met with warnings and uneasy glances. Stay away, they'd say. It's not safe. But for a photographer, the words off limits often sound like an invitation. By the end of my first week in Havana, I'd made up my mind. I had to see it for myself. I wasn't just searching for photos. I was searching for stories, and El Faro del Olvido promised one I couldn't ignore. Little did I know, my fascination with the lighthouse would lead me down a path I was utterly unprepared for. A path that would make me question what I knew about fear, reality, and the price of curiosity. The idea of visiting the lighthouse consumed me for days. Each time I walked along the streets of Havana or sat at a cafe, my mind wandered back to the stories I'd heard. Locals had warned me, sure, but they didn't understand. For me, it wasn't just about curiosity. It was about uncovering a hidden part of history and immortalizing it through my lens. Finding someone willing to take me there, however, proved to be a challenge. Most shrugged it off with excuses, bad weather, unreliable boats, or simply a refusal to discuss the place further. But I persisted, and eventually I found a fisherman who didn't outright say no. His name was Emilio, a man with leathery skin and calloused hands that told the story of years spent at sea. His eyes, however, betrayed a weariness, as if they'd seen too much. When I asked about the lighthouse, his expression darkened. "El Faro del Olvido," he repeated, almost spitting the words. "You don't want to go there, señorita. That place, it's cursed." "Please, Emilio," I pleaded, trying to sound confident despite the growing unease his words stirred in me. "I need to see it, just once." He stared at me for a long moment before finally sighing. "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you." The journey began early the next morning. The boat was small, its engine sputtering to life as we left the safety of the Havana docks. The sea stretched endlessly before us, a vast expanse of blue-green water that shimmered under the rising sun. At first, Emilio didn't speak much, focusing instead on navigating the choppy waves. I occupied myself by photographing the horizon, the distant specks of islands dotting the water. But as we drew farther from the mainland, he began to talk. "You know, they say the lighthouse keeper was the first to disappear," Emilio said suddenly, his voice carrying over the hum of the motor. "Santiago was his name. A man dedicated to his duty, but one stormy night, he vanished. No one knows how or why." I paused, lowering my camera. "Vanished? They found the lighthouse abandoned," he continued. His belongings were still there, but he was gone. No body, no trace. Some say it was the sea that took him. Others, well, they believe it was her. "Her?" I asked, leaning forward. Emilio hesitated before answering. "The spirit of a woman who drowned near the island." They say she calls to those who come too close, luring them to their deaths. I tried to dismiss his words as mere superstition, but the unease in his tone was hard to ignore. As we drew closer to the island, the once clear sky began to darken. Clouds rolled in, heavy and ominous, casting shadows over the water. The sea grew rougher, the boat rocking with each wave. "That's the storm coming," Emilio muttered, tightening his grip on the wheel. "We need to make this quick." In the distance, the lighthouse came into view. It stood like a sentinel against the horizon, its silhouette stark and foreboding. Even from afar, I could see its crumbling exterior, streaked with salt and time. "El faro del olvido," Emilio said, pointing ahead. "The lighthouse of the forgotten." The name felt heavier now, its meaning sinking in as I stared at the structure. I had wanted an adventure, a story worth telling. But as we approached the island, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that I might have bitten off more than I could chew. As the boat approached the shore, the first thing that struck me was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, oppressive kind that seemed to press down on everything. The waves lapped gently against the rocks, but beyond that, the island was eerily still, as if it were holding its breath. Emilio maneuvered the boat to a narrow strip of sand. "This is as close as I can get," he said, his voice low, almost cautious. He didn't even bother tying the boat up, just killed the engine and gestured for me to get off. "Are you not coming?" I asked, half joking, half hoping for company. "No," he replied flatly, his eyes fixed on the shoreline. "I'll wait here, but don't take too long. Storms is brewing." I nodded, slinging my camera bag over my shoulder, and stepped onto the island. The sand was cool and damp under my boots, quickly giving way to rough patches of stone and tangled root. The air here was different, thicker, and tinged with the faint smell of salt and decay. I took a deep breath and began making my way inland. The path, if you could even call it that, was overgrown and barely visible. Gnarled trees stretched overhead, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the daylight. I kept tripping over roots and slipping on patches of wet leaves. As I pushed further, the remnants of human life began to appear, scattered like ghosts of the past. A torn fishing net tangled in the underbrush, its fibers frayed and brittle. A rusted chair leaning precariously against a tree, its legs sinking into the damp soil. I paused to take a picture, and the click of my camera the only sound in the suffocating quiet. Further along, I noticed markings on a large, moss-covered rock. At first, I thought they were graffiti, but as I got closer, they seemed more deliberate. Words in Spanish, weathered and faint, interspersed with symbols that looked like prayers or warnings. "Perdona mi, Maria. No tolerar." That message just sent a chill down my spine. And whatever had happened here, it wasn't just a forgotten island. It was a place people had abandoned, and not without reason. It took nearly an hour to reach the lighthouse, and when I did, it stopped me in my track. The structure towered above the treetops, a monument to neglect and decay. Its once white walls were streaked with algae and rust, the paint peeling away in jagged strips. The base was cracked, and vines snaked their way up the sides, claiming the building as part of the island. The windows were dark and empty, like hollow eyes watching my every move. The closer I got, the more imposing it felt, as though it were alive, daring I would have stepped inside. I paused at the base, staring up at the top where the light once shone, now a broken, jagged frame. The waves crashed against the rocks below, and for a moment I felt a sense of vertigo, as if the lighthouse were leaning forward to swallow me whole. Reaching out, I placed my hand on the damp surface of the wall, the cold seeping into my palm. "This is it," I whispered to myself. "This is what I came for." But as I stood there, staring at this towering structure, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered something else entirely. "You shouldn't be here." Crossing the threshold into the lighthouse felt like stepping into a forgotten world. The air was dense, saturated with the sharp tang of salt and the faint, musty scent of mildew. My steps echoed unnervingly, each creak and shuffle amplified by the silence pressing against the walls. Inside, time had left its mark. The once proud structure had fallen into decay. Rusted metal, damp wood, and fragments of broken furniture lay scattered like the aftermath of an unseen storm. A spiral staircase twisted upward, its edges flaked with corrosion, leading to the unseen heights of the tower. As I wandered cautiously, my gaze landed on a rotted table near the base of the staircase. Among the debris was a book, its leather cover warped from years of exposure. Something about it drew me in, and when I picked it up, I could feel the damp texture of the aged leather against my palms. It was a diary. Opening it, I saw a name scrawled inside, Santiago. The entries were dated decades ago, the ink faded but still legible. I turned the pages, curiosity growing with every line. The earlier entries were simple observations about the tides, the weather, and maintenance routines. But as I read further, the tone began to shift. Santiago wrote of hearing voices at night, whispers that seemed to come from the sea. He mentioned seeing fleeting figures near the shore, shadows that dissolved when approached. His writing grew more fragmented, his words heavier with unease. I could understand only about half of what he wrote. The Spanish phrases danced just out of reach of my comprehension, their meanings teasing me. It was frustrating, yet compelling. I grabbed my phone, relying on a translation app to bridge the gap. The process was painfully slow. I'd read a few words, type them into the translator, and then piece together the meaning. Each revelation felt like opening a door into Santiago's crumbling mind. One entry stopped me cold. He described a night when he awoke to the door of the lighthouse swinging open, the salty wind howling through the room. Stepping outside, he saw a figure standing at the shoreline, unmoving but unmistakably watching him. Another entry detailed the voices calling his name, faint at first, then louder, more insistent, until they seemed to echo in his very thoughts. I paused frequently, glancing over my shoulder as I read. The dim light filtering through the cracked windows seemed to shift with every flicker of my nerves. Translating the diary wasn't just time-consuming, it was disorienting. The effort to decode Santiago's words made me lose track of the minutes ticking by. The growing shadows in the lighthouse were my only indicator that the day was slipping away. The storm I'd noticed earlier was nearing. The sky outside darkened, casting an ominous glow through the broken windows. The final entry I managed to translate sent a chill down my spine. Santiago wrote that the spirit, or whatever haunted the lighthouse, had grown stronger. It no longer waited for him to seek it out, it came to him. He felt it, not as a presence to be seen or heard, but as a weight pressing against his very soul. Closing the diary, I placed it carefully back on the table. My hands trembled as I stepped back, the weight of Santiago's words settling heavily on my chest. The lighthouse didn't just hold history, it breathed it, exhaled it in a way that seemed to fill every corner. And I was standing in the middle of its lungs, feeling the weight of its gaze. As I climbed the winding stairs to the upper level of the lighthouse, each step creaked beneath my weight, echoing through the empty structure. The air grew colder the higher I went, and I felt an inexplicable heaviness pressing against my chest. When I reached the top, I was greeted by a circular room with walls streaked in greenish mold and grime. The small windows that encircled the space allowed in fragmented beams of light, creating a surreal patchwork of shadows on the floor. I carefully moved toward one of the windows, my camera in hand. I had been sure to close all the windows earlier. The last thing I wanted was more rain damaging my equipment. But as I approached, I noticed one of the windows slightly ajar, the frame rattling softly against the wind. The thin curtains hanging there fluttered wildly, like they were trying to escape. And I paused, my pulse quickening. Had I forgotten to secure it? Or had someone opened it? The thought sent a shiver through me. Steeling myself, I reached out and pushed the window shut. As I did, the wind died down for a moment, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint, barely more than whispers against the creaking of the old structure, but unmistakable. Someone or something was moving. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, ears straining to catch the direction of the sound. It seemed to come from below me. But the sound felt unnatural, like it echoed from everywhere at once. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my effort to sound steady. No response. I reached for my phone in my pocket only to remember the lack of reception. Great. alone on an isolated island in an abandoned lighthouse with what? A trespasser? My heart was pounding. But I wasn't ready to flee just yet. I turned toward another window to scan the area. The coastline stretched out before me, waves crashing violently against jagged rocks in the distance. My eyes darted across the landscape and then I saw it. Far off, near the edge of the water, a figure stood motionless. My breath hitched as I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It appeared to be a woman, her silhouette framed against the turbulent sea. She was unnervingly still, her posture rigid, as though she was waiting for something or someone. Grabbing my camera, I lifted it to my face and adjusted the lens, focusing on the figure. Just as I was about to snap a photo, the figure moved. Or did it? It didn't walk away. It didn't run. It simply vanished, as though the wind had swept it into the ocean. I lowered the camera, staring at the empty shoreline. My mind raced for an explanation. Was it the mist playing tricks on my eyes? The light refracting oddly through the rain-soaked air? Or was she real? The footsteps from below sounded again, louder this time. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to remain calm. I turned back to the stairs, determined to figure out if I was truly alone in this place. The first crack of thunder shook the air as I descended from the upper level of the lighthouse. The storm had arrived. Rain lashed against the walls, its rhythmic pounding like a relentless drumbeat. I peered through one of the small windows, and my stomach turned as I saw the waves outside rising higher, crashing with fury against the rocky shore. Inside, the air was damp and suffocating, a mix of mildew and salt. The lighthouse groaned under the pressure of the wind, its old frame protesting with each gust. I knew I couldn't leave now, even if I wanted to. The island was cut off, and my only option was to wait out the storm within the Ferrol's decaying walls. Suddenly, a flash of lightning illuminated the room, throwing every shadow into sharp relief. My heart nearly stopped as I saw her again. The figure. She was closer this time, standing just beyond the entrance to the lighthouse. The pale outline of her dress fluttered unnaturally in the wind, and though I couldn't make out her face, I felt the weight of her gaze piercing through the storm. I stumbled back, gripping the edge of a rusted table to steady myself. "No," I whispered, willing the image to dissolve like before. Another flash of lightning came and she was gone. The doorway was empty. But I wasn't reassured. If anything, the absence of her form felt even more menacing, as though she could be anywhere now. Then I heard them, voices. They started softly, a murmur carried by the storm, weaving through the sound of the rain and wind. "¿Quién está aquí?" I barely managed to whisper the question. though I wasn't sure who or what I was asking. The voices didn't answer. Instead, they seemed to multiply, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. They reverberated off the crumbling walls, overlapping in a discordant symphony of sorrow and rage. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voices weren't just external. They were inside me, clawing at the edges of my mind. Another lightning strike tore through the darkness, and the light briefly flooded the main room of the lighthouse. Shadows danced wildly along the walls, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement, an outline of something rushing past the stairs. No, I told myself, my voice trembling. You're alone. You're alone. But the words felt hollow, a mantra that couldn't pierce the growing dread in my chest. I grabbed the diary from where I had left it, clutching it like a lifeline. Its damp pages felt heavy in my hands, and I realized I had been shaking uncontrollably. Whatever was happening, I needed to stay in control. This was just a storm, I told myself. Just a trick of light and sound. It's a little trick of light and sound, thought Willem. But even as I tried to rationalize it, the feeling persisted. An overwhelming sense that I wasn't the only one seeking shelter in the lighthouse that night. I found myself retreating into what must have been the keeper's room. The air inside was different, thicker, colder, with the weight of untold stories. The room was small, barely enough space for a narrow bed, a rusted desk, and a chair that seemed on the verge of collapse. On the desk, an oil lamp sat unused, its glass stained with time. Next to it, a stack of loose papers and the tattered journal I'd been reading earlier. I sat on the edge of the bed, trembling as the wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and picked up the journal again. My hands shook as I opened it. But I couldn't stop now. The diary felt like the only lifeline in the suffocating isolation of the lighthouse. The entries grew more fragmented, more desperate. Santiago's words described a figure of a woman, one he believed to be the spirit of his wife, lost in a shipwreck just off the coast. His grief was palpable in every stroke of the pen. He wrote of how her presence began subtly, a whisper in the wind, the faint scent of her favorite flowers. But as the days turned into months, and the months into years, her presence became undeniable. She was angry, he wrote, furious. Her wrath was directed at anyone who dared to approach the lighthouse. Santiago had tried everything, prayers, rituals, even offerings to calm her unrest. He described lighting candles in the storm, speaking to the sea, begging her to let him be at peace. But nothing worked. The final entries were the hardest to read. They spoke of her voice growing louder, calling to him by name, beckoning him to join her in the waves. Santiago wrote of seeing her reflection in the mirrors, her handprints on the fogged glass. His once strong handwriting became erratic, words slanted and broken, as if written in a frenzy. The last line stopped me cold. She is here with me now, waiting. A chill ran down my spine. The room suddenly felt too small, the walls too close. My breath quickened, and I glanced around, half expecting to see those handprints Santiago had described. The storm outside raged on, the relentless sound of waves and wind amplifying the growing unease in my chest. I knew I had to leave, but something held me there. It wasn't just fear, it was curiosity. A desperate need to understand what had happened in this place to this man, to the woman who haunted him. But as I closed the diary and placed it back on the desk, I realized the wind had changed. It wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside, circling the room like an invisible presence. The storm outside roared like a beast unleashed, shaking the very foundation of the lighthouse. The walls groaned in protest, and the once faint whispers had grown into a cacophony of voices, mingling with the relentless pounding of the waves. I didn't know if they were real or if my mind had finally given in to the terror of the night. The door to the keeper's room was jammed shut. No matter how hard I pushed or pulled, it wouldn't budge. As though the lighthouse itself was conspiring to keep me inside. My heart pounded like a drum, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I turned to the window. It was my only way out. Rain lashed against the glass and the wind howled like a wild animal, but I didn't care. I couldn't stay here, not with whoever was in this lighthouse with me. With trembling hands, I unlatched the window and shoved it open. The cold wind hit me like a slap, carrying the scent of salt and decay. As I prepared to climb out, something caught my eye. She was there, just outside, standing motionless in the storm. Her white dress clung to her figure, soaked and torn, stained with streaks of something dark. Blood? Her hair was plastered to her face, but through the tangled strands, I could see her eyes. They were locked onto me, glowing faintly in the storm's chaos. My stomach twisted into knots and I froze. The diary slipped from my hands and hit the floor with a dull thud. Her gaze bore into me, unblinking and accusing, as if asking why I had dared to disturb her sanctuary. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move. With a surge of adrenaline, I climbed through the window, my fingers slipping on the wet wood as I lowered myself into the narrow ledge outside. The winds threatened to tear me from my perch, and for a moment I thought I would fall. But then I jumped. The landing was rough. I hit the sand hard, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. For a moment, I lay there, stunned, as the rain poured down around me, but I couldn't stop. I didn't dare look back. This time, I scrambled to my feet and ran. The wet sand sucked at my shoes, and the wind fought to push me back toward the lighthouse. But I didn't stop. The only thought in my mind was to get to the boat, to get away from this cursed island. By the time I reached the shore, I was drenched and shivering, my heart racing like it might burst from my chest. The boat rocked gently in the storm-tossed waves, and the silhouette of the fisherman appeared like a lifeline in the darkness. He didn't ask any questions as he helped me into the boat. His face was grave, his eyes heavy with an understanding I didn't want to acknowledge. Without a word, he started the engine and we pushed off into the angry sea, leaving the lighthouse and whatever haunted it behind. As the island faded into the distance, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder one last time. Through the rain and the mist, I thought I saw her standing at the edge of the shore, her figure blending into the shadows of the storm.
Even as the lighthouse disappeared into the mist, its secrets remained. What truly happened that night on the island? Was it the spirit of Santiago's lost love, bound by tragedy? Or something far darker, guarding the lighthouse's mysteries? These are questions that will linger long after the tale ends. And yet, dear listener, would you have had the courage to face such a night? Or would you have turned away from the shadows? The choice, as always, is yours. If you're craving more chills and suspense, don't miss one of our most haunting stories, the Japanese tunnel ghost. Follow Michael Carter's journey into the heart of Japan, where an ancient legend comes to life in a dark and eerie tunnel. Click the video on your screen now to uncover what awaits him in the depths of the unknown. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the shadows. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you're ready for the next story. Until then, keep your courage close and your lights on, because you never know what might be waiting in the dark.